Again, welcome to today. It feels a little bit like a family reunion as I run into a lot of people I know. And my name is Julie Gamradt, obviously on the program. I'm with the Communication Aids and Systems Clinic. And I'm here today to kind of segue into the next area of thought related to people with cerebral palsy. And that is, how do we intervene? What kinds of things can we do? With a really special focus on assistive technology. And the communication assistive technology is often called augmentative and alternative communication, which is a big mouthful, so I'm not going to say that very often. I'm going to say AAC. Having this opportunity, I often will reflect upon how did I fall into all of this, and I think fondly of a 12-year-old boy with cerebral palsy that I met in my very first job a little over 30 years ago in a school district. And I experienced the overwhelming power of providing a communication system to that child for the very first time in his life. He could say yes and no when I met him. And that brought me here to the UW-Madison and to Weissman Center specifically because at that time there was very little happening around the country related to augmentative communication. So I'm pleased to be able to share what I know and give you some ideas of what you might be able to do with your own family or on your own teams. As Katie has already really nicely framed, there's a lot of barriers to communication development for kids that have cerebral palsy. And I'd like to talk about AAC today really being a bridge over some of those barriers. So if a child is experiencing expressive language delays or receptive language delays or both, what might we be able to provide them related to AAC that could really help them get over some of those barriers and advance their skills? And I think the exciting thing that really, I think being part of the augmentative communication world for so very long, I've seen such an explosion of technology, and I think the iPad has impacted lots of people for entertainment and other things. But certainly in the last 5 years or so, especially in the last couple of years, really has been a game changer in the area of AAC. And I think one of the exciting possibilities is that more and more speech and language pathologists will have access to tools that they can actually try with their students, for example, in a school district, and help address that problem of not having enough augmentative communication for kids that really could benefit from it. ASHA, the American Speech and Hearing Association, talks about AAC as being anything that isn't an oral method of communication. That's pretty broad. And as we've already talked about a little bit, that it isn't just for people that don't talk at all. It might also be something used in conjunction with speech skills. And as we talk about AAC, we're not only talking about tools, but also some strategies. And for some people, AAC might be a temporary need, a support to language development and social participation before that speech kicks in. But it also, for some people, might be a long-term need. And so thinking about what are some of the barriers that happen with communication, and I've made this little graph here. Let's see if I can figure this out. There you go. I'm always a little nervous using lots of technology. As much as I've worked with it, I never, ever trust it. There's something bound to fail during this presentation, just to warn you. So some of you may have learned a second language and had entered into an immersion experience where you might go to Spain, for example, and learn Spanish, or at least become fluent in Spanish. Many of us, or all of us, probably can't remember our first immersion experience, which is when we were born. Our family started to present us with a rich spoken language. They overlaid it into routines where there was a lot of repetition, and that led to us understanding language. And for kids with CP, they might have vision, hearing, motor, cognition, lots of barriers that might interfere with either being able to benefit from the repetition of the routine. Maybe they can't see what's all going on, or they can't move to see what people are talking about. And one of the things I'll highlight here, especially for kids that might need to use AAC long term, the rich spoken language input is really a symbolic immersion experience. most of the time when we're thinking about symbols, we're thinking about this kind of thing. You know, a lot of you have run into these kind of symbols. But actually speech, spoken words are symbols. And they are the most complex symbol because they have nothing to do with what they represent. So if I say tree, it has absolutely no relationship with that thing with leaves on it outside. So we're presenting really complex symbols. And then the other thing is that they're disappearing symbols. So the moment I say tree, it's off into the air and it disappears. So that can be a great disadvantage if I can't move quickly enough to see what Mom said and what she said, you know, what she was doing when she said it. So some of the visual symbols, for example, they stay put. I can actually have more time to see it. And so, so that immersion experience for a child that might need to use these alternative symbols most of the time does not include the symbols that they might need to use to express themselves, if that makes sense. You're benefiting from being exposed to speech, but what about the symbols that I might need to use to express myself? Most of the time they're absolutely absent during that very critical language development period. Expression comes along, and as Katie outlined, it can, for typical kids, go very rapidly from no words. In fact, we spend a lot of time talking to babies, right? And nothing happens. And I would just say that unlike what can happen with kids with disabilities, we don't look at a baby the day we take them home and say, you know what, I'm presenting these really complex disappearing symbols, and you don't look to be ready. In fact, you're not even looking at me when I'm talking. You don't even have your eyes open when I'm talking. But yet I persist, and I have the audacity to say really complex symbols that represent really complex ideas. I say love. I love you to my baby. Love is a darn hard thing. How do I even take a picture of love? So I think that same readiness notion oftentimes does get overlaid on kids with cerebral palsy, for example. Gosh, I'd present them with these visual symbols, but they're pretty hard, especially those symbols for like want, things like that. I think I'm going to hide those symbols until that child shows me they're ready. So unlike what happens in typical development where we say, we're going to immerse this child in all of these words and we're going to see what happens, hopefully this happens. But with kids with disabilities, sometimes we get into this testing mode, readiness mode, and we hide the symbols until they somehow show us they're ready for them. So really being able to develop these verbal tools, these expressive tools, leads to really a powerful foundation, especially for kids that have motor and other impairments that make it difficult to learn and do new things. What you want to do, becoming concerned when some of this doesn't happen. But the iceberg has a lot happening before those first words even appear. The child is learning about the world. A child with cerebral palsy can have problems learning about the world. They can't move around, they can't see sometimes. So there's lots of barriers that can interfere there. So what can I do about that? Understanding words. We already see evidence that comprehension delays are common. And especially with those disappearing complex symbols, could I bring in a visual and map those into a routine and have more success and support a child to learn more easily because they have a tool that doesn't disappear on them. So here I just kind of echo what Katie was saying, the argument for early intervention and really a magic wand if every child that might need expressive symbols that are alternatives to spoken words could have that immersion experience early in their life so that the first time they're presented with symbols, we're not asking them to use them, we're showing them what they mean. So for the most part, people that might need to use specialized symbols really are living in a desert when it comes to learning them. Usually they're presented and expected to know what to do with them. And when they don't, people say they're not ready. How in the heck are they supposed to learn them? You know, so I think sometimes flipping out of the testing mode and into the teaching mode is something I hope to inspire in you today. And some of you already have that down. So thinking about AAC as a bridge, A few points to keep in mind. I think some of these have already been covered by Katie, so I'm not going to go into great depth. But it's not a last resort to introduce symbols. And if there are some harms in waiting and seeing, you know, maybe my child will talk, so why do they need to start with some of this stuff? Well, it can be a nice support for them to speak. And there's no evidence that AAC will hinder speech development, which can be sometimes a concern. And sometimes if a child doesn't start using something I hand to them, like symbols, well, by gosh, maybe they've never been shown how to use them. Maybe they've never seen people using those specialized AAC symbols. Or maybe it's just a really wrong system. It might be too hard, but I've just as frequently seen kids being presented with something that was so simple and to be almost meaningless to them. So it could be an ill fit. So as we start looking at some of the options, which is the more interesting part of what I'll do, we want to first make sure a child is well fit with what tools we might want to use with them, that we often call feature matching, and it's what we might do in an assessment. And once matched, the system has to be made really relevant to that person. It has to be motivating to that person. So we have to be able to change it. And putting it in place is the first step. The training is the big piece. We have to shift our mind into teaching instead of, gosh, they're not ready. And funding is always a concern when we start talking about fancy, expensive equipment. And it's something we spend a lot of time talking about with families. And I've given a handout on that very topic, because what comes into our conversations now is, how do you fund ones that are through medical insurance, and what about iPads? Are they covered? They're not covered, but there's lots of other information that I thought would be helpful, and there's no way I'll be able to talk about it today, so I put it in a handout. So I'm going to be able to only highlight some things, and here's where some of the juggling with technology that makes me a little nervous happens. So I'm going to try my projector camera here and showing some things. So here are some low-tech options. And some of you you're very familiar with some of the symbols. These are board maker symbols. These are symbol sticks symbols. That's another symbol set. So early on, it's great if a kid can start plugging into some kind of set. Photographs are nice, but how do you photograph want and love and like and things like that? Those abstract concepts that really are part of language development early on, how do you represent them? These symbol sets do it, and then if you use a set, you're sticking to one way to represent some of those hard concepts. The other thing I'm going to mention is PEC's Picture Exchange Communication System. I'm not going to go into great detail, but it's a handing system, and it was developed for people with autism to teach them that notion of exchange. I've seen that inappropriately used with some kids with CP. First of all, it's very hard for them to hand if they have a fine motor problem, and they may not have a problem with that concept of exchanging. So that is not always a good place to start with all kids. And I see it over applied. Let's see here. Ooh. Yeah, I'm trying to bring it up. I have an assistant in the background here. I anticipated trouble. Thank you. Thank you. Related to that notion of immersion, I'm going to mention the Pragmatic Organization Dynamic Display, or POD. It's a concept that some authors came up with to support that whole notion of immersing children into specialized symbols when there's good reason to believe they're going to need them to express themselves or to support their comprehension. So they have these rather comprehensive books that can be in a variety of formats. This is just one, but most of the time people's reaction to putting a book like this in front of a 2-year-old is like, whoa, that's way too much. But we're still presenting them with invisible, disappearing spoken symbols, but somehow there's a different standard for specialized symbols. So The notion of this would be for a parent or any communication partner really to pair this within those routines, adding not just spoken words but also the symbols themselves. So I mentioned POD because you can go online, you can read about it. It isn't the only strategy of immersion of symbols, but it is one that really I think has brought that issue up into more visibility in our field. The notion I have to be bringing these symbols into routines and using them for a person to learn them. So as I would be going about my day, maybe my child is becoming upset, I would say, oh, something is wrong. I'm going to go to the something's wrong page. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're just plain grumpy. I don't know. And I'm not going to be putting in front of them and saying, oh gosh, did they understand those words? If they don't, maybe I should hide them. Maybe not have so many. So I'm just trying to challenge that concept of not exposing a child to things that they may not be ready to learn, or maybe they're not ready to use. But again, we didn't apply that standard to typical kids, right? Okay, so low tech. Many of you are familiar with the little buttons. Ooh, my battery's going. See, I knew at least one thing would go wrong. My battery. Trick or treat. So let's say my child can't say trick or treat, but I want my child to be part of that. This is a great tool for that. It is something that you can record. You can record sequences of messages. And I see these kinds of tools, these what they call static recordable devices. They're a nice participation tool, but frequently the limits, like I have to change pages, keep me from wanting to have it as the only system for a child. And dedicated devices, which 3-4 years ago I would have spent my whole talk on, are ones that meet insurance standards, and that means that they can't have computer features like games and accessing the web and email. But they still, even especially relevant for kids with CP, they still have the best range of pages. They still have the best range of physical accommodations. They have eye gaze, for example, joysticks, head. You can use head movement. You can do a lot of specialized access that you can't yet do on an iPad. Now for some of the iPad apps. And I'm going to again make a risky switch here. So this is an app called Go Talk Now, and it's one that we use a lot with kids with specialized access needs. It's made by the Attainment Company. And one of the unique features of this app is that you can use switches. If a child can't use their hands at all, you can use switches with it. Oops. So this, oops, I just set off my iPad here. But this is the box that I'm using, and the switches that are interfacing with my iPad. And I'm going to go back here and just do a quick demo. So you can see, oops. It's supposed to be speaking, but that's okay. You can see I'm moving the light with my switch. And then if I hit my second switch, I can do really cool things like even play movies. And it's okay if it doesn't have speech. It's supposed to, but that's okay. So Go Talk Now, the advantages are really that it offers some of those access methods, but the limitation is that it doesn't have as wide a range of pages, so that if I have a child that can kind of plug into one of the pages that I can modify, we often call them page sets. They're kind of designed with a lot of thoughtfulness by people that have expertise in language. The Go Talk app has a few pages but not a lot of pages, and so we tend to use it most for kids that need a lot of really customized displays and maybe as a starting point. Now to talk briefly about a couple of others. Touch Chat is probably the app that we use the most with kids that can use their hands. And Some kids will use them in conjunction with key guards that are specially made for the app, for the type of iPad, for the case, for the page set. So they have to be very carefully selected. But if a child needs to poke their hand through the hole, then it sometimes prevents them from making a lot of errors. So in this case, what I'd like to demonstrate is a comparison as to why we might choose this for children when they're trying to learn to combine words into sentences. I'm going to compare this one with Proloco to Go, which is another app that is probably the most commonly known app. But I want to show you that every app, even if on the surface they look the same, they're not. So I'm going to say a sentence, I want to play cars. I don't know why I don't have sound. Let me see here. We're going to have to live without sound, so you're going to have to watch my message bar at the top. So what I'd like you to do actually is count how many times I make a selection. I want to play cars. So what was it, 5 or 6 selections? Now I'm going to switch out to Proloco to Go, another app. It looks kind of similar. But now I want you to count how many times I pick words to make that same sentence. I want, page down, little words. To, go back to home. Page down, actions. I happen to know that play is a making verb. I'm not sure why, but it is. Play. And then I'm going to go back to home. And then I'm going to go down. And I'm going to go to things. And I'm going to go to toys. And then I get to cars. Whew. So I have a child with a fine motor disability. I want them to learn to make sentences. And I put that in front of them. And it becomes an immense challenge. So I've created yet another barrier for that child to learn how to make sentences. So the take-home message really isn't to memorize that this is a good app or this is a bad app. That's not really the message. It's really fitting so that the things that the app really supports well are what fit the child's needs. The Proloco to Go app doesn't have as many page sets. It certainly doesn't support constructing sentences from scratch, making more complex sentences as well as some others, but it does have scanning. So TouchChat does not have scanning. So that's a difference. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about all of the apps. I've given you a grid on the apps, actually, and some of the clinical thought processes about the features that would cause us to match them to kids. And I'm going to I've given you some participation apps. Oops. That I won't have time to talk about, but you can look up some information on them, even within iTunes. So kind of in ending, I wanted to show you that there are accessibility features in your iPad that you may not know about. It's kind of a work in process. It's still really emerging, but guided access is probably our #1 used access feature, and that is I can lock a person into their communication app. So if they want to play Dora all the time, that they can't play Dora, they really have to use it for communicating. And there are also they even have scanning for the iPad, but it has a little ways to go. It's quite a little difficult process to use it. Like on TouchChat, you could theoretically make that a scanning app by using the iPad scanning, but it's quite dicey. And I've already mentioned there are key guards, and you have to match the key guard to the iPad you have, the case you have, the app you have, the page set you have when you order them. And the little switch box that I was using is called Praetorian. That allows my switches to communicate mainly with apps that have a built-in scanning feature. And there are many, many different types of switches, and our occupational therapist would try to match a switch type to a child's motor needs, as well as to figure out where to place the switches. And just a quick mention, Judy Lynn and Inclusive Technology make a lot of fun skill development apps for switches, and can just be for fun too, for cause-effect activities. And just like there are for devices made and funded by insurance, there are many ways in which you can mount it to a table or a wheelchair, etc. And finally, some of the people that are coming in want it all. They want to be able to drive their power wheelchair with their joystick, and they want to, and I would be one of those people that would want it all, right? You would too. Be able to operate their phone and their iPad, perhaps using the same joystick that they use to drive their wheelchair. And so there's a new thing called a Tekla Shield that allows that kind of integration. And what would be the most powerful thing you could do as a family member or a team member in a child's or an adult's life? Model, model, model. Create an immersion experience. Be the tour guide for the language that's there. Anticipate that a child will not just need to see something demonstrated once or twice, but they'll have to see it over and over and over again. Don't expect that the child will know what to do with something when they're just handed it to them. And so if I can dispel that notion of readiness that I think is over-applied to kids with disabilities and not at all consistent with how natural development happens, really incorporating things into a child's life will be the most important and powerful thing you can do. And for more information, we have a podcast, really, that gives it's an older podcast, but there are some segments on just augmentative communication, and then especially for older students and adults, there's some kind of fun segments on using AAC to support work outcomes, and you can take a look at those. They're in iTunes. You can download them for free or just watch them there. And then also, Katie Husted and I did a webcast series for young kids a few years back that is also still available that talks about some of these very things. So, I don't know if I have time for questions, but I do have lots of gadgets up here that I didn't have time to show and tell, but I thought if I had them around, perhaps during break or whatever, I'm happy to have anyone interested come on over and take a look. Do we have time for questions? Okay, any questions?
You mentioned a handout.
Julie, I put them on the table right outside the door.
Oh, table right outside the door. There's one on insurance, one on apps. And I think one of the things I want to mention, I didn't mention the Compass app by Dynavox. Very important to mention this, because all speech and language pathologists that are members of American Speech and Hearing Association can download that app for free. And if they get all of the page sets, it's worth several $100s. And I think just having that tool available for a lot of speech and language pathologists will help them incorporate it into their practice, help them try it with kids. And Dynavox really still is one of the leaders in a lot of different page sets. Those pod books that were very ominous looking, they have the pod on the Compass app, for example. And there is a 30-day trial version that you can use. It doesn't give you all the pages, but I think that came out just the last few months. And this free ASHA member access is really quite new. And I think it really does, as kind of a game changer, I'm hoping that therapists will be excited about having access to that tool. Any other questions?
I noticed that a number of the tools you were presenting assume that the participant has functioning vision.
Oh,
Can you speak to anything specifically?
very good
Like
question. I forgot to demonstrate one of my gadgets. And I'll just do, this will just take a second, hopefully. If everything works, of course. Okay. A lot of times we're presenting the symbol of choice for many kids with vision problems is spoken words, and we're teaching them a way to listen to the spoken words and present a signal, and that's oftentimes early training. This is another thing that a child that's kind of gone through that process, he's now 9, and he's learning auditory fishing. So he listens to cues, and the GoTalk app is really the only app that allows you to use touch entry as well as having audio cues. And so it's a really nice app for those kinds of applications. So this child has a key guard in place.
My stomach hurts.
Go potty.
I'm tired. I want you to help.
Frustrated.
I'm frustrated.
So the first thing the person that's using this, it presses it and here's a cue. If that's the one they want, they hit it again. And they're learning to press.
Go to each page.
They're learning to press the bottom corner item to take them
Go to opinion page.
to go to different pages. So it's called auditory fishing. So I think partner-assisted auditory scanning and auditory fishing are probably the most common strategies. But I've also seen some kids with cortical vision problems, if presented, I've seen kids do some amazing things with their vision, even if after a lot of experience with AAC. So sometimes they have that motivation to use their vision in more practical ways. Any other questions?
What did you mean by scanning? I mean, I know what eye gaze is, but I'm not sure what you mean by.
So did you see, remember that one app I had that had the yellow boxes going across? So that, I don't know if I have time to show it to you, but why don't you come on up and I can show that to you again, maybe at break. But that's really where, instead of the child having to touch it, they're listening or watching, and the device is going to circle this choice, this choice, this choice, and they press a switch and say, that's the one I want. And so that can be either through vision, where they're watching the scan, or it might be reading the options out loud, and the child learns to hit the switch to say, that's the one I want. Sometimes they're using 2 switches. That's a good question.
So, we'll take a break.
I think now is time for break.
If you want to ask questions.
And you can feel free to come on up.